Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
I'm Haripriya Narasimhan, Associate Professor, Department of Liberal Arts, IIT Hyderabad. This is the first lecture in the course on anthropology and popular culture. In 1993, Deborah Spitulnik, anthropologist, talked about how there is still no mass media in anthropology. And she talked about how anthropologists had not looked at the role and influence of media forms because they had stuck to the traditional ways of looking at people and culture. But things have changed since then, and my lecture today draws heavily on the introduction by Faye Ginsberg and Leela Abulagoat in the edited volume called Media Worlds, where they talk about how far anthropology has come since 1993, and this book is edited in 2002. So, before we go into the discussions of how far anthropology has come in looking at media and popular culture, the first question we want to ask is, what does anthropology have to do with media? And one of the obvious answers is that it is everywhere. It is omnipresent. We anthropologists study peoples and cultures, and almost all cultures are now embedded with media forms, and therefore it is incumbent upon us anthropologists to study the role of media in people's lives and how culture and media interact with each other. So one of the most obvious forms of looking at media would be television, cinema, digital cultures, etc. And this gives an opportunity for us anthropologists to engage with other disciplines. Like cultural studies, for example, drawing heavily upon theoretical developments in these other disciplines and using tools available within anthropology to then look at media cultures. It is, of course, when Spitulnik was talking about how there is no mass media in anthropology, she was talking about how generally there hasn't been extra interest in media forms, but anthropologists have in their own ways looked at media forms even in the past. Like Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, who have written a well-known study on the Hollywood industry, for example, that people often look to is Horton's Powdermaker's study of how Hollywood as an industry functioned, and this was way back in the 50s. So, of course, anthropologists have looked at media before as well, but it wasn't so intrinsic to the field as it has become now. So, what caused that change? One of the important points that forced anthropologists to look at, or enabled anthropologists to look at new forms of culture such as media, has been the change within the discipline since the 1980s, when after writing culture and things like that, scholars started looking more critically within the discipline and about how we represent other people that we study. So, one of the important questions that anthropologists started asking is was about representation, and then media becomes a very important agent in understanding representation of other peoples and other cultures to diverse audiences, both Western as well as non-Western. And also anthropologists are heavily focused on indigenous peoples. In India particularly, there is a big division or a small division, depending on how we see it, between anthropology and sociology, but generally it is commonly understood that sociology is about the study of urban peoples, and anthropologists would focus largely on indigenous groups. And this also became a point where media got into focus, because increasingly people were becoming aware of how indigenous peoples in particular and other groups were represented in media forms. Documentaries are one media form that we understand very easily, and if you think about say National Geographic documentaries, for instance, about how peoples are represented, or even famous movies like Beautiful People or other movies, where indigenous peoples are represented in a particular way, and then anthropologists have to take a critical stance and look at how this representation is problematic or not problematic. And therefore there came to be more awareness about the necessity for us to engage with various forms of media, because increasingly the penetration of media forms in not just in cities but in rural areas and into lives of those people who we believed were almost untouched was increasingly becoming apparent. So that is one of the reasons why and how also anthropologists came into looking at forms of media and forms of popular culture. So one thing that anthropologists had as an advantage in terms of borrowing theories and methods from other disciplines, but also improving them or embedding anthropological methods into these concepts, is also the kind of intense field work that anthropologists do in the cornerstone of method that we call ethnographic. Now, what do we mean by ethnographic? We mean long-term, very intense, very in-depth kind of field work which allows us to gain knowledge of peoples and their lives and how their lives are affected by various aspects. So some disciplines, for instance, would largely depend on methods like reception studies or something like that. Now, when an anthropologist enters that arena of media, then the anthropologist has the tool of ethnographic method to take the same aspect, which is how the audience understands a particular media form, but take it out of a closed setting, take it out of the living room or the cinema hall or whatever, and then put the same media form in people's everyday lives, and then see what is the transaction that is going on between the people and these forms of media, and how one and the other impact each other, and what new forms emerge, or what other notions or ideas have now been challenged because of this new form that is coming into their lives. So this also, the ethnographic method also becomes very important for us in understanding why anthropologists thought that they had something more to say to media understandings, which until say 3 decades ago at least was more studied by people from disciplines like cultural studies or media and communication studies, and not so much or so often by anthropologists. So this is one point, the importance of ethnographic method, which gives us another strong tool to look at the same topic but in a much more in-depth manner. So, it just don't do surveys or focus group discussions, but we do a lot more. We go into their people's homes and into their lives and see and observe as well, not necessarily always ask, but also observe how people are interacting with a particular media product. Another thing that also prompted anthropologists to look at forms of popular culture is the cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural perspective that also is emphasized in the discipline. So, soon across cultures, scholars were able to understand that media products were traveling from one place to another place, usually from the north to the south, but increasingly also from the south to the south as well. One example would be Purnima Mankekar's very well known study of Indian television during the late 1980s, early 1990s, which she has documented in her book Screening Culture, Viewing Politics. So, we understand from that historical work that telenovela, which is a form more popular in the Latin American countries, then morphs into not exactly the soap opera that we understand today, but more about a serialized kind of fiction programming on television, which starts with Hum Log. So, the television serial in India does not necessarily start from an American soap opera like Dallas being taken as the model, but more of a Mexican telenovela being taken as a model. In any case, the transactions are both between the north and the south, and between south and south, and maybe in future between the south and the north as well. But this travel of media products also became very obvious to anthropologists, who then started looking at it as they looked at. So, we were also talking about what are the advantages of anthropology getting into or focusing on media. One of the things that anthropologists can show would be how media is not what people assume it to be, largely influenced by the developments, both theoretical as well as technological, from the Western perspective. Anthropologists can also show, because they study peoples from diverse backgrounds across the world, they can also show how the large media industries are also constantly challenged or added to by small time players, as the authors call them, the small time players in small parts of the world. And here they are referring to a lot of work done on the kind of media that are produced by people themselves. We can think about, say, community radio in India, or we can think about the kind of videos that have been made by indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. But the fact is that anthropologists can throw light on what media becomes, what kind of an entity it becomes when it is taken out of the largely urban centric, Euro-American centric world and is produced and enacted upon in other parts of the world. So, that is a very important contribution, if we can think of it that way, that anthropologists can do. But what is the real question as to why anthropology should be even interested in media and popular culture is precisely for the word culture that is there. So, we all know that culture is a word easy to say and more difficult to define, and a focus on popular culture will enable us to push the boundaries as to how culture is defined, how culture is understood, how it is practiced, and how it is challenged by people in their everyday lives through a look at the kinds of forms of culture that they engage with, media being one of them, but a very important form as well. So, if we look at a scholar like Leela Abulagod and her work on television, she talks about it in this introduction, and she says that people like her, many scholars like her who were working in different parts of the world in the 1980s, were able to see how forms of media were becoming more and more popular and important and almost kind of an omnipresence in people's lives. Her work is based in Egypt, and she looks at women's songs that are very popular, and then how people that she was studying were following serials which were serialized on radio, and then started looking at television. And in what ways were people connecting to television dramas or soap operas. Her focus was more on these kind of dramas which occurred, which were telecast during Ramzan in Egypt, and followed heavily in the Arab world, Arab speaking world. So that is how a lot of scholars who did not start with focusing on media and popular culture came to be engaged with these forms, because these were the forms their informants were engaging with very critically. So for anthropologists, it becomes incumbent upon us to also look at those forms of culture that our informants are engaging with in an everyday manner, and on which they have very critical ideas and issues to talk about. So that becomes very important as well. So and like I said before, in this task anthropologists have recourse to theoretical developments from various fields like cultural studies, like philosophy, political science, sociology. So anthropological understanding and methodology with regard to studying media can only be enriched by using and looking at methods from these disciplines. In terms of large umbrella concepts theoretically, which are crucial for anthropologists to even begin looking at media forms, we can look at various scholars like Stuart Hall. So in the future lectures I will be talking about influence of scholars like Stuart Hall, Habermas and say Benedict Anderson, and these scholars whose theories have been very influential for us, not just in studying media and popular culture, but in various other aspects as well that anthropologists have been looking at. Now, Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities is an extremely important concept because there are various levels at which media is looked at from an anthropological perspective. One is that of the importance or the embeddedness of the media in people's everyday lives. In what ways do they engage with these forms of media? How do they add to the kind of discussions? So we can think of, for example, FM radio. FM radio is something people listen to every day. We can, as anthropologists, not pay attention to it, or we can choose to pay attention and listen very closely to the conversations that are happening between the anchors and the audience, and then try to figure out what is going on here. The other is at the level of the state or the nation. And this is where a scholar like Benedict Anderson becomes very important, and for people like Abu Lughod, who looked at the kind of nationhood, a sense of nationhood that was developing or that was constantly discussed in people's interpretation of Egyptian television dramas. These kind of Anderson's concepts become very important. So when they talk about understanding of nationalism from the point of view of imagination, this is a very important concept, but also a very difficult concept, because imagination is not easy to understand as well. So how do anthropologists who, when they go into the field, they go there, they first do a household survey and then collect data, for example, depending on the topic that you want, collect numerical data and other forms of qualitative data on housing or income or health or whatever. How do we look at an idea like imagination, and how do we understand these concepts, or more constantly used term nowadays is aspiration. So how do we understand these sort of very slippery, nuanced concepts? There also it becomes very important, these kind of notions of imagination. And Appadurai is also another scholar about which we will discuss in the later lectures, who talks a lot about imagination as well. And one way in which Aboulegod and Ginsberg talk about is laid out in previous anthropological studies of, for instance, exchange. You know, how one product travels from one place to another place, and what kinds of values and meanings it acquires as it travels, and how these things change. So that allows us one way to look at these kind of media forms. And then when we talk about media forms that travel, we also have to look at beyond the nation state, which is the global. But before we go there, one of the ways in which the nation state and media interact is not a very smooth engagement, but a rather contentious engagement, about which scholars like Stuart Hall and Mazzarella have all written about. Censorship is one of them. Where the state tries to exert control about what kind of messages can go out into the public sphere. Now, public sphere is a concept that Habermas talked about, has been critiqued, but also very important for us to understand. So then the public sphere is where the state and various media forms meet each other, and there is a lot of tension there. But also about where the media form then takes another role entirely, precisely because of this engagement with the state. So the state informs, challenges, this interaction with the states informs and challenges the kinds of meanings that media forms then acquire. So understanding the kind of sense of the nation, nationhood, concept of nationalism, all of these things become very crucial. Once again, Purnima Mankekar's study becomes a very important reference point with respect to India. The kind of a notion of the nation that is created by watching programs on television and talking about it. So that is just one example. The other point that anthropologists focus on is the engagement with the global. So now we know that with the beginning of satellite television in India, the media landscape has completely changed, and now the engagement with the global is at a very, very different point than where it was when it first started. And this is also something that we have to look at and study very critically. So one way, for instance, which the authors mention is looking at what they call transnational subjectivity. For a person to be located in one place, but being engaged through media forms with notions and concepts and ideas of the self which emerge from other places. We can think about say, for example, youth in some urban areas of India who are probably more clued to programs that come on Netflix, for example, than watching Indian television channels, and therefore living in some kind of a transnational, experiencing some kind of a transnational subjectivity. This is a question which has to be explored, but these kind of possibilities now exist because of our focus on media and popular culture. So studying media text also brings to the anthropologist another question about what is the kind of tension that we constantly think about in terms of what is more important, whether society or culture takes precedence, or is it individual or collective people's aspirations which become more important. Another tension which plays itself out in media forms like cinema and television also becomes a site. It is like a field site for anthropologists to study how the society is articulating itself. Whether the society can be seen as a kind of a text, and whether that text is supreme, or how that text is challenged constantly by those who write it, for example, the people themselves. So this tension between culture and individuality again, or even collective identity, has been explored in anthropology and can be explored further with focus on media and popular culture as well. What else can an anthropological focus on popular culture tell us? One of the things it can show, as was mentioned earlier about, say, community radio and things like that, is a kind of media as resistance. Media as a site for struggle and resistance, as some scholars will argue. And we can then look at media as a place where subaltern identities and imaginaries and aspirations come to the fore. And here we can also look at studies like that by Ang, who looked at these viewers watching this very famous American soap opera called Dallas. And Ian Ang's study can then tell us about what does it mean for people to watch this in a different setting and what emerges out of it. Another well-known study is by Janice Radway on romance novels and women reading romance novels, for example. Usually women reading romance novels will not come under many scholars' attention because it is not seen as an activity which is of great theoretical interest to many people. But Radway shows us how it can be and how it can allow us to talk about gender, for example, or about forms of pleasure, or many topics which usually are just under the radar for many disciplinary focus. So these kind of studies can focus on media and popular culture can alert us to kinds of activities which usually will not be seen or observed unless we take this lens. Another example closer to home will be looking at the kind of studies which are emerging now from central and northeastern parts of India, looking at media forms. For example, Santali videos and movies that are produced in the language of Santali, which many people will not know of unless a scholar takes that kind of an approach and looks at these things. And they tell us a very different story of how people look at themselves through these media forms. Now, a focus on a big industry like Bollywood, for instance, will kind of not allow us to focus on these smaller forms of media as well. So therefore, anthropologists can take various perspectives and look at the way in which a culture or cultures engage with the state, the global, as well as with itself through forms of media. Now the state also, is seen as this big hegemonic thing which has a huge hold, and so does the culture industry, as scholars tend to call, say for example, Hollywood or even Bollywood. These industries are seen to have huge clout, power, money, and are very hard to break into. They determine, it is assumed that they determine the discourse and can channel the discourse in the way that they want. Anthropological research shows that it is not as easy as we assume that to be, and that it is not the case, and these big hegemonic industries are also constantly challenged from within and outside. However, this also needs to be deconstructed, and anthropologists are better placed to use anthropological methods of in-depth research, of ethnographic methods to do so quite well. Another aspect also in the sort of discussions between the global north and the south in talking about globalization, one of the things that also comes of interest to anthropologists would be the interest in what is called world cinema or third world cinema, or with these different labels. What exactly is going on there? Why is there now so much interest in, say, Bollywood or Chinese cinema coming out of China or cinema coming out of Korea? All these film festivals that happen in different parts of the world, and platforms, digital platforms particularly like Netflix and Amazon, which also popularize these kind of cinemas to different parts of the world. What is going on here? What kind of engagement are these different culture industries, if we wish to use that term, engaged in? Is also something which can be of interest. Studying popular culture from an anthropological perspective can enable us to critically look at the kind of questions that anthropology has been looking at for a very long time, such as, say, modernity, globalization, all of these things, and they can allow us to look at anthropology's understanding of the notion of culture and of the very discipline itself. I mean, how do we go about studying, understanding culture when things are changing so fast? And also looking at different sites of study. So partly due to focus on say media and popular culture, anthropologists can also focus on people at the production side of it, so studying up in some sense. The viewers or the audience, as always. So we can study up and we can study across, looking at production sites in different parts of the world or even within the country. We can look at diverse stakeholders and also document what is currently going on, how things are changing right now in the place where we are looking at, and therefore also inform theoretically the disciplinary perspective as well. So in these ways, a kind of focus on media from an anthropological perspective is extremely important and needed, particularly in the Indian scenario. So one issue for anthropologists to look at is the larger debate about what is popular culture. Usually, and from most perspectives, it is seen as, because it is popular, it cannot really be very high status. Raymond Williams mentions it as people seeing it as some kind of inferior quality of work, you know, if something is aimed at becoming popular, then it cannot really be very sincere effort. It cannot have artistic value. You know, it is made by the people for them. So, you know, what is how significant should it be? So, there is a lot of what is called as othering going on here, and anthropology students will understand what we mean when we say creating the other, you know, othering. So, it is us and then the other, and this kind of an understanding of high culture versus popular culture is something to look at from anthropological perspective. So, one thing we have to understand is time plays a very big role. So, what would be considered popular today might actually become classical later on. So, in the later lectures we will see this, particularly with regard to music, how the classical is actually created in some ways from the popular. One instance is this very well known film Amar Akbar Antony, which when it came out in the 1970s was seen as a masala film. I mean, there is not much aesthetic value attached to it. It was not considered intellectually very high or challenging our thoughts. It was just seen as a form of entertainment. Now we have a book on it by 3 scholars, which talks about how a sense of brotherhood and the nation is created through this movie called Amar Akbar Antony. So, that is what we mean. So, something which which is usually dismissed as because it is popular, it is not important, can actually tell us a lot more about what is going on at that particular point of time. So, you know, popular is always kept in opposition to art. So, popular cinema versus art cinema. If you recall, India had some kind of a movement in terms of parallel cinema in the 1970s, which was also called as art cinema, and it was seen to be more representative of more cerebral, intellectually stimulating, demanding kind of work with characterization, picturization, the way the locales were selected and they were supposed to be real, as opposed to the fictional ones created by movies like Amar Akbar Antony. So, this is how popular culture is always pitted against something which is then classified as art, high culture, more prestigious because it is not followed by everyone, it is followed by a niche group, and therefore it is more prestigious than popular culture. So, one constant binary classification that we see in studies of popular culture is between the high and low, but obviously it is not so smooth. Even in art movies versus popular movies debate, there were actors who straddled these two spheres. There were a lot of people who were interested both in the reach of cinema. So, for some people popularity also means reach. So, if you are an artist, you also want to reach as many people as possible rather than restrict yourself to a niche audience. So, these kind of binary classifications are not really helpful for us in understanding what is going on first. Second discussion is about authenticity. So, where is the real culture of a nation state or of a community or of a subgroup, whatever it might be? There is some kind of a notion in most people's minds that there is a real authentic culture which is out there, which just needs to be located, which is untouched or unaffected by commerce, by processes of modernity or globalization. And this authentic culture is then resurrected as the culture. Now, the other issue there, what makes this debate between authentic culture versus culture which is from somewhere else, is also about what if that authentic culture is also very popular culture. Does it, and also what is authentic culture at all in the first place? How do we even know that this was, is and has always been the authentic culture of a particular place, and there isn't anything else which can confirm, come to make that situation complicated. Well, the reason it is difficult to say that about cultural forms, particularly art and music and things like that, is because there has been a lot of contact between different parts of the world for a very long time. It is not like some places were untouched for ever and ever, and other places were not. What we understand to be popular culture largely are coming through the interaction between different cultural forms, not because they have just been left there to be by themselves and suddenly today resurrected and recognized as the authentic or traditional culture. So, that is one problem. The other issue that happens with understanding culture is also how do we interpret it, what are the tools that anthropology has to do it. And here Geertz plays a very important role, because it is with Geertz's interpretation of cultures that we kind of get a sense of how culture is not about, is not a text which is sitting there for us to read and just describe, but we have to actually interpret what is going on here. And you can recollect the Balinese cockfight, a very famous essay written by Geertz, where he kind of looks at every single act that's going on in looking at that cockfight. So, cockfight, Geertz doesn't call it as a form of popular culture, but cockfight is a very popular sport in Bali. So, that essay can throw light on how an anthropological analysis would differ from, say, an analysis of a popular form of sport or art or music from other disciplinary perspectives. What Geertz does in that cockfight is to delineate every layer of action that goes into making a cockfight happen. The actors involved, the preparation that goes before the cockfight takes place, the actual cockfight, and what happens when the cockfight is dispersed because of police coming into the picture. It is just one example of what an anthropological lens will throw into a form of popular culture, which might be interesting and useful. So, one issue, like I said, that anthropology has to understand the larger debate that goes on in the world of popular culture is about high culture versus low culture, or classical versus popular, elite versus popular, high bro versus low bro, all these classifications that are in people's minds. One thing that we have to understand is it is not as simple as that. And the second point is about trying to locate authenticity is also not a very useful exercise, rather interpreting what we see from an in-depth perspective, thick description like Geertz would say might be more useful. And also what anthropology also would tell us is to differentiate between the norm and behavior, what people say they do and what they actually do, which is why participant observation and observation will be very useful. Another thing is also anthropology as a discipline and particularly when looking at popular culture, we draw theoretical input from various disciplines, from literature, from philosophy, from cultural studies, from communications, history, all of these, feminist theory, gender studies, all of these fields will give us theoretical inputs, but we also have to actually see this in practice and not take the grand theories themselves for granted. We also have to look at how these theoretical views play out in practice in everyday real lives. So, one scholar who talks about anthropology and popular culture is Johan Fabian, whose work has been in South Africa, particularly in Zaire. So, he says that what actually affixing this term popular in front of culture, what does it do, is he says that it might allow us to actually see the kinds of things that people were doing, which we would have otherwise missed if we had just gone into a field site to study culture. So, usually what anthropologists will do is to go into a village or a city or some cultural setting, have a set of questions, they have certain topics in mind, they go and collect data and come back. Participant observation and staying in a place will allow you to see a lot more, but what Fabian is pointing out here is, without knowing about popular culture, we might still miss a lot of things. In fact, he talks about popular, he gives examples from his own research to talk about how when he first went into his informant's areas, he was not paying attention to the kind of paintings that were hanging on the walls, or furniture or clothing, and later on he goes to talk a lot about African art and popular African art, and he says that can tell us a lot about African culture. So, one needn't ignore popular culture in order to understand a particular culture. This also gives you an insight. And he says we should not quibble about these terms and words, is it culture industry, is it cultural goods, is popular culture a better word to use, or a mass culture is a better term to use. He says it is not so much about semantics, this is what the people are doing, and therefore we have to study it. For an anthropologist and a sociologist, the reason to look at it is that this is what people do. People sing, and therefore we look at songs. People are engaged in some kind of ritual, therefore we do it. They are engaged in a ritual dance, therefore we look at it. So, we look at popular because it is what the people in that culture think it is. They do not differentiate between this is popular and this is not popular. This is the culture for them as far as they are concerned, and therefore it is a legitimate query for an anthropological study. He also says we have to look at the historical conditions in which these popular culture forms are embedded, and he talks about a particular dance form called Kalela dance, for example, which was described by Clyde Mitchell in the 1950s, which is done by these migrant workers in the Zambian copper belt, a kind of a fusion of all the different groups that come together without looking at it as a form of popular culture. Now, what would that analysis look like if the perspective of popular culture was used? So, what Fabian is saying is that you do not have to really think too much about, do I study this? Is this something that I can study from the perspective of anthropology? He says if it is a form of culture, then that is good enough. And in terms of his own work in Africa from the 1970s onwards, he talks about how initially scholars working there kind of paid attention to what the migrant workers were doing and how they were all coming together in what was called quote, ethnic associations. And what were these ethnic associations for? To preserve their culture. How do you preserve your culture? How do you keep your culture going? You get together, you sing those songs, you cook that food that was cooked back home, you perform some dances if required, and so on and so forth. So, cultures are reproduced and memories are held on to in this way. Now, this way was how anthropologists were looking at it before popular culture came into anthropology as such an important theoretical perspective. So, he also talks about creolization, which was going on. So, there was these cultures that people came from, particular groups that they came from in villages of Africa, and then they work in the copper belt, and there is another culture with which they are interacting, and then something else comes out of it, which is what creolization is about. And also this division we have between art and work. He says that informants usually do not categorize things that way also. What one group considers as art might actually be what work is. So, these kind of boundaries and categorizations and classifications will not allow us to engage in a more creative way in which in how things happen. So, his conclusion is that culture should be in the plural. Cultural practices are dynamic and creative, and power relations are very important in order to understand what is going on. So, these creolization of a particular popular culture form might be a response to the power struggles in which the people are embedded at that particular point of time. So, he says we should pay attention to power there. And also when we put a lot of things together as African dance or African music or African painting or whatever, he says, what are we lumping together? What are we missing? You know, are we right to be putting these disparate things into one label? We have to be a little more careful there. And we also have to recognize impact of colonial and post-colonial conditions and encounters between people of the first world and other worlds, and even within the developing nations, within the third world, the huge difference between those who are studying and those who are being studied. You know, these situations in which scholars and informants, researchers and informants are embedded, are situated, will also have to contribute in our understanding and approach to what we consider as popular culture. But most important is not to get carried away by these classifications of high and low, good and bad culture, popular and not so popular culture and all that. From an anthropological perspective, those conclusions should not be taken at face value. They have to be investigated. Thank you.